this is what the Gospel and Life Journey campaign thing is all about. Right? It's not just another cute church thing. It's about finding the areas in your life that you don't really believe the gospel. You think you do. And you know the gospel, but you don't really believe it. It's about finding those areas and putting the gospel into them. And there are places like that for all of us, whether you're not a Christian or you've been a Christian for a week, or if you've been a Christian for 3 times longer than I've been alive. I mean, we have to find those places and just expect that God's going to come in and he's going to shake those up. Because think about it, the whole time in this story, God is in control. The whole time. Right? I mean, when Jesus is crucified, God knows he's going to raise Jesus. And God rolls the stone away, and God sends the angel. God is in charge. He has complete control over what feels like an unstable situation to the women. And so to Nick's point last week, if you don't know what God is doing, you just can't know what God is doing. If we don't know what God is doing, that God is going to shake things up, then we won't know what God is doing. And our faith will come tumbling down along with the lives that we planned for ourselves. And look, I'm not saying we shouldn't plan. We can plan and we should plan diligently. That's not what I'm saying. But we need to be ready for God to come in and shake those plans up time and time again. We have to live our lives with the fluidity and the flexibility of having a master. And not just any master, but a master that's powerful enough to raise someone from the grave. Okay, so then if God is going to continually send earthquakes in our lives and shake them up, then how do we retrofit our lives so that when God shakes them, our faith doesn't come tumbling down? In order to retrofit our lives, God has commanded us to be a part of intimate Christian community. God has commanded us to be a part of intimate Christian community. Look at verse 7 again with me. The angel says, "But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he has told you." The first command given to anyone after the news of the resurrection is, go and tell other believers. Don't try to process this in isolation. But look what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, go tell the people who didn't believe before. I mean, you might expect that after the guy who the Jews and the Romans killed gets raised from the dead, God might send a couple people to Pilate and to the chief priests to tell him, hey, the whole crucifixion thing, it didn't really take. Like, oops, he's alive. You know? You might think that, but that's not the command. That's not the command here. The command is to tell the disciples and Peter, the ones who already believed. So why? It's because God's plan is for Christian community to be the stabilizing force in your earthquake-ridden life. God's plan is for Christian community to be the stabilizing force in your earthquake-ridden life. Because when God throws an earthquake at you in your life, you need people to lean on and encourage you and help you figure out what God is doing. And when God throws earthquakes in our Christian brothers and sisters' lives, they need us to encourage them and to help them figure out what's going on in their life. God designed it this way. Because look, the thing about earthquake engineering is engineers don't build structures, don't build houses that can't shake in an earthquake. They build houses that will withstand the shaking despite the shaking. Right? I mean, our brothers and sisters are the stabilizing beams, not that stop the shaking in our lives, but that hold the house up, hold our lives up despite the shaking. Okay, so I have this friend named Natalia, and that's Natalia and I, from college, and we're pretty good friends. She was in the dorms together with me. We were on the same floor, and then we found out we were both Christians, and we ended up going to the same Christian fellowship and actually living in the same apartment complex after freshman year. And so we're pretty close friends. And so I asked her if I could tell this story. But since the time I knew Natalia's mom had been sick. Because of some complications with pregnancy, she'd been on long-term dialysis, and which led to this rare disease. And so she was in and out of the hospital. But then this past March, she got a urinary tract infection, which eventually spread to her intestinal region, which just sent her into a medical tailspin. And so for the past 3 months straight, Natalia's mom has been in the hospital. For that time, she was in the ICU for 3 weeks straight. And Natalia would drive an hour to the hospital every day with her dad, and her mom would be unconscious, and she'd have a hard time breathing. She was on pain medication, so she was hallucinating. So Natalia couldn't even really have a conversation with her. And then Natalia showed up to the hospital one day, about 3 months ago, or a few months ago, and her mom had a breathing tube in her mouth and an oxygen mask on, and her hands and her feet were tied to the hospital bed because she was hallucinating so bad. And she had IVs in both her arms and in her stomach. And the doctor came in that day and sat Natalia and dad down and said, "Look, your mom has a number of organs failing, but I'm not as concerned with that as I am her head. My primary concern is her head because she's still hallucinating and she's been off pain medications for 3 days now. And I can't figure out why. She shouldn't be. She might have fluid in her brain. We're going to do a CT scan. But if we find fluid in her brain, she's going to live a couple days, and that's going to be it." Natalia is 22 years old. She's got her whole life ahead of her. She just graduated from college. She's going to get married one day. And she just got told her mom might die in a couple of days. How is she supposed to respond to that? What's she supposed to do with that? I'll tell you what she did. I got a text that morning along with a whole bunch of my other friends that said, "Guys, I'm really scared. My mom's in the hospital, and we're not sure what's going to happen. She may not come home. Please pray." And man, if we didn't pray like we'd never prayed before, and we called her and consoled her and encouraged her as best we could. And so, Natalia's mom isn't totally out of the woods yet, but she is still alive by the grace of God. And she actually came home on Thursday. I was talking to Natalia on Wednesday, and her mom came home on Thursday after 3 months, and so she's doing a lot better. Yeah. But the thing is, this has totally shaken Natalia's world. I mean, it's shaken everything. Her plans about grad school and pretty much everything else in her world. But it hasn't broken her. Her life hasn't come tumbling down because she had a community of believers who loved her and loved Jesus that could come around her and help her figure out what God is doing. And he is working. He really is. Natalia's dad's not a believer, but he's come to church with Natalia now, and he's asking her about her faith and how she could be so at peace with all of this. And asking her to pray. God is working mightily through this, but one of the things Natalia said to me as we were talking this week about this is she said, "I don't know how I could have made it through this without my Christian believers coming around me. I wouldn't have made it. I don't think I would have made it through this." The angel's command to get in community in verse 7 is not simply a plea to spread the gospel to the other believers. It's not. It is that, right? But it's not simply that. It is a command of love to get in community. God knew the women were going to need that if they were going to survive this. And they did. And Mark doesn't tell us this, but Matthew tells us that the women initially were terrified, but they eventually did go tell to the other disciples and Peter. And Christian community ended up being a huge part of the early church. Because Jesus himself instituted that community. He's the great community builder. He had built, before he was crucified, he built a perfect community of close friends who loved each other despite their issues. And so when the earthquakes came of Jesus' death and his resurrection, they were ready. Nick talked about it last week. Mark himself never would have made it without the community of believers, people like Barnabas. He needed that community. And it's what we need too. We need to allow Jesus to build community between us. We have to find ourselves a group of believers who can come to know us intimately, so that when God comes and he shakes our lives to the core, he completely destabilizes us. We have people that can stabilize us, that can hold us up. Because we too are living in the wake of the resurrection, in a time that is earthquake-ridden, where God is continually shaking things up as he brings the kingdom of Jesus in full. And so now I'm gonna plug small groups pretty unabashedly. Not because this is the only way to find Christian community. It's not. But it is one of the best and easiest ways. And it's the Mac version, if you will. So, all right, get in a small group. Get in a small group. You have to find people who you can share your lives and your earthquakes with, and people who can share their lives and their earthquakes with you. At some point, you'll be on both sides of that equation, and God has commanded us out of love to be a part of community, intimate community with each other. Okay, so last week, 315 people signed up for small group, which is awesome. I mean, praise God. If you're holding out, I can't promise you it's not going to be awkward at first. Probably will be. That's how these things usually go. But you need to find Christian community that can stabilize you when God shakes your life. And you need to be involved in helping Christian brothers and sisters hold steady in their earthquakes. And so pick up one of those forms out in the lobby and then fill it out before you leave. Don't leave here without filling it out and turning it back into the table in the lobby. And if you're already signed up, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Now you actually have to go. Okay? You actually have to show up to wherever you signed up to be and actually go. And once you're there, I encourage you to share some things that you wouldn't normally share. And get to know these people on a deeper, more intimate level, so that when earthquakes come in your life, man, you're stabilized. Okay, so for these women, the week of Jesus' trial and death and then his resurrection were all massive tremors that shook them to the core, that just absolutely terrified them. But their problem was not the earthquake. Right? The earthquake was Jesus died and that's the best news in history. Right? The problem wasn't there. The problem was that they weren't prepared for it. They didn't expect that God would shake their world like that. And so when he did, they were terrified. And that'll be us too. We need to expect that God is going to continually send earthquakes in our lives. And his plan, the tool that he's given us to withstand those earthquakes, is community with our Christian brothers and sisters. We need to get in that community and prepare for that earthquake, because it's coming. It's coming. And when it comes, remember that Jesus is the one who was shaken time and time again and never crumbled. Jesus was shaken when he was tempted in the desert, and when he was ridiculed by the Pharisees, and when John the Baptist was beheaded, and when he was betrayed and tried and convicted and crucified. He was shaken over and over again, and yet he never crumbled. His faith never wavered. He lived fluidly under the direction of the Father. And as a result, death was conquered, Jesus was raised, and he is not in that tomb. So even death has no sting anymore. So no matter what earthquake comes our way. Let's pray.